Stephen A. just revealed that in a private conversation he had with Isiah Thomas, the legendary Pistons guard, that Isiah Thomas said that Steph Curry would not have averaged more than 18 points a game in his era. What do I think about that? So, the first thing I like to bring up, I think we're all biased towards the eras that we grew up in, or that we grew up during our childhood with. So for me, obviously, I would have some bias towards the 90s and early 2000s. That was the era that I was growing up with. The 90s was most of my childhood. The 2000s were my early adult years, I would say. So there's a bias towards that era. I'm not going to lie about that, but I still try to be objective about the whole entire thing. One thing I'll say is another example how we're biased. I give my example of being biased when it comes to just the sport of boxing. Growing up, I would always believe Mike Tyson was better than Ali, simply because Ali to me came across as this old guy who was from another era, and he had to suck because, again, he was some old guy from an era that was a long time ago, and in my mind, those guys had to be weaker than the current boxers. So Mike Tyson, easy without a doubt, would be better than Ali. There was no doubt in my mind. But then I remember when the movie Ali came out during the early 2000s, I actually started researching more into Ali. I got a curiosity about his previous matches, and I watched some of his old matches on ESPN Classic back then. So I then started to look at it more objectively, and I saw some of the things Ali could do, and I was able to conclude that Ali would beat up Tyson in a fight simply because he was bigger, he was stronger, just he was ridiculously strong. He could take hits, and he was very quick at moving. So he combination of being able to avoid getting hit and just being a great knockout puncher and just his size, I think would have overwhelmed Tyson simply because I remember whenever Tyson lost, it was always the bigger, stronger dudes that could absorb some of his punches, then dish it out. Even when he lost to Buster Douglas, and then later on Evander Holyfield, and then Lennox Lewis. All those guys were taller, bigger, stronger than him, and they could take some of his hits, and eventually Tyson would wear down and lose. And I suspected the same thing would happen with him and Ali, for being honest. So I think that reflects, just on my case, just how I can understand why young people are biased towards their own era, because you think in your mind that whoever comes from your era has to be the best because humans prior to that were weaker, and that evolution happens at such a rapid rate when it's not true. Scientists have said that it takes thousands of years for a human body to really evolve. So I don't really believe the stuff when it comes to this argument, like, yeah, these guys are just evolutionary figures. No, I just don't believe in that stuff, that they evolve that quickly. Now with the equipment and shoes and just training, that plays a huge role in these guys being as athletic as they are today. But I don't think the gap is that high. You play these guys in from the previous era, and you give them the same sports medicine, they're still as good. And I don't think the sports medicine is that much of an enhancer of guys' careers, more so than the rules. I think the rules play a huge role in this. And this is why I want to bring up just what the NBA used to be like, during the 90s and early 2000s. I'm not going to comment on the 80s because that era was before my time. I remember nothing of it, but I remember basketball starting in 91 and what it was like. I feel the 90s from, I would say, about 91 all the way up until 2006, 2007, I was labeled that era as a defensive era because I felt defenses were more emphasized and the rules allowed for it. Even though the NBA started changing the rules during the early 2000s, they didn't really enforce it. They started enforcing it, I would say, after 2006, 2007. They started cracking down on it, and every year afterwards, the defenses would get weaker because they would enforce it even more. So it was incremental to a point. You felt the change, I would say, during the early 2010s, probably around, I would say 2013, 2014. That's when you started to really see the changes in these games, just how strongly they have changed it. And that's really when Curry's career took off. I would say the biggest thing back then is hand checking. I know people want to argue it doesn't make a difference, but it does. You can even see this at the lowest level. Try playing a game of pickup basketball in your own park and start doing hand checking. Let me explain to you what hand checking is. Hand checking allows you to put your hand on a player's hip when guarding them. So they could drill the ball and you can put your hand on their hip. And that makes a huge difference because you can ride them. You can push them in a different direction. That can allow you to defend them much better. It gives them less options to counter you offensively. It's a big deal. Another part of hand checking is you can slap their wrist when dribbling the basketball. and you don't get called for a foul, try doing that. See how much harder it will be for a guy to score on you if you're able to have those attributes, and the refs don't call it. Really, they wouldn't call the slapping the wrist really often at all. Maybe once, twice during a game they would call it. So you had to be strong to play through that. Guys are slapping at your wrist. They're pushing you on the hip. I look at a guy like Draymond Green. For some reason in the current NBA, he's like the only player they allow to hand check. If you watch a lot of the Warrior games, you'll see him hand check it left and right. Hell, if you watched last night's game with the Lakers, he was allowed to hand check Anthony Davis, and that was one of the biggest reasons Anthony Davis struggled against another night. So I think that's the biggest example of hand checking makes a huge difference. Without hand checking, Draymond would be garbage. I personally think he already is, but without it, he's pretty much useless. The refs allow him to get away with it in this era, but no other player can take advantage of it. Draymond's the only one I see. For some reason, they don't call it against him, but I'm just using that to show you how powerful hand checking is. That's something that every player had to deal with, and it affected the perimeter players even more than the big men. That's why big men were more valuable back then, because they could overcome hand checking much more easily than the perimeter players. So it does have a huge effect, and I know some people say, like, well, look at Steph's ball handling. He would be able to still be great. I think he would be limited, even with great ball handling. I look at a guy like Allen Iverson, and as great as Allen Iverson was, he was scoring 30-some points a game. You look at his percentages throughout his whole entire career, they were putrid. He was shooting, I think, he was a career 42% field goal shooter from the field for his career overall. He shot putrid percentages, and a lot of that had to do with hand checking. No matter how great AI's ball handling was, his percentages were never great, and that's all due to hand checking, a huge reason of it. Now, people wonder how could the Sixers won all these games with his putrid shooting? Well, the Sixers were also a great defensive team, and that allowed them to succeed in spite of his bad shooting percentages. But that's how it was back then. You also had to figure back then when it came to just ball handling, the NBA did not allow you to palm the ball like they do it today. What the players are able to do today with their ball handling, I know people are impressed by it, but it would have been called traveling back during the 90s and throughout the mid to late 2000s. In today's NBA, it's not called traveling, so that makes a difference. Imagine a guy like Harden getting called for traveling with all the moves he does, or just all these other top players. It's why a guy like Giannis can dribble from coast to coast, or these big men are dribbling the ball down the court. It's not because they're better than big men of the past. It's because they allow them to travel. It's much easier when you're allowed to travel and carry, and the refs are just turning their back and they're not paying attention to it, and they're told not to call it. So I don't think the ball handling today is better than back then. I don't believe that for a second. Tim Hardaway, AI were great ball handlers. You have plenty of dudes who could handle the ball, but they were not allowed to do the tricks you're able to do in the current NBA. I bring this up because Steph Curry would not be allowed to do the things he's doing now with his ball handling. That would be called travel. So that's going to limit how he can dominate a game. So that would limit it to a large degree. I know some of the arguments I've heard on some of these posts on Facebook and other social media is like, well, look at Steph's dad, Del Curry. He was a pretty good player during the 90s. He would be even better than Del. So the way I address this argument is that I watched Del throughout the 90s. I grew up in North Carolina. I saw probably 40 to 50 Charlotte Hornet games a year. So I saw them locally on TV since they were the home team. And so I know a lot about his game. I know everything about him. I would say the biggest thing that separates Steph Curry from his father, Del, their shots are very similar. They both have quick releases. The biggest thing would be the ball handling. Del was not a great ball handler. He didn't have the ball handling skills that Steph had. So I'll give Steph that over him. Steph is a better passer than Del simply because he was originally supposed to be a point guard. So he has above average passing skills. I wouldn't say Steph's a great passer. He has that over his father. So I'll give you that. But if you put Steph in the 90s, I don't think he would have been that much better than his dad, Del. I don't think so at all. And I think he would have suffered from the same exact problems Del suffered with, when it came to the playoffs. That Del was a massive playoff choker. I saw that a lot. He was much worse in the playoffs than the regular season because back then the playoffs would be even more physical than the regular season. And I saw Del get punked many times in the playoffs by the Knicks and the Bulls. those are the two teams that the Hornets played regularly throughout the 90s whenever they made it to the playoffs. They would always have to go through one of those two teams, and they would always lose. They never could overcome it. I'm not going to blame Dell for the reason why they lost. Those teams were just better, but Dell really sucked against them, and that had to do with the physical play. He got intimidated. He got pushed around by those players. He just could not cut it in those situations. They really got into his head. He played scared. You could see it physically, and I know I'm biased, but Steph is really cut from the same mold as his father. I've seen whenever teams were able to get physical with him. Like, for example, in 2016, the Cavs with him, when LeBron blocked his shot and got up in his face and told him to man up. You could see from his body language, he was scared, and he broke down that series. That would be happening on a regular basis with him during the playoffs. Teams were aggressive like that, and they didn't have to worry about the foul trouble. It would happen on a regular basis to Steph. I really do believe that. I really do believe that he's not going to be able to overcome that. He's not strong enough to deal with that stuff. You had to fight back then, literally fight back to show these guys that you're not a punk and you're not gonna deal with their crap. And Dell didn't have it, and Steph doesn't have it either. So I think he would have gotten bullied the same way Dell did. He would have been physically bullied. He would have been manhandled, and he would have games where he just played poorly, just worse than what he's had now. So I think using Dell as an example is a bad example. Just it proves the point again what people are saying, that he wouldn't be as good during the 90s or early 2000s. So I know some people bring up Reggie Miller, but I'm just going to go into this tangent with Reggie Miller and Ray Allen. You'll see why. It was much harder to win with a shooter back then because these guys could not shoot consistently well in the playoffs. I look at Reggie Miller stats against the Knicks. He only had 2 series where he shot 45 and above against the Knicks. And in one of those series he lost. The first one was in 93, where he put up great numbers against the Knicks, 31 points per game on overall 50% shooting. He lost that series. They lost in 4 games that year in the first round. And the other series he had that was great against the Knicks was in, I think it was 95. He shot 45% overall from the field. So 45 and above to me is a good number for shooting well overall from the field. If you're shooting below 45, you're just inefficient. The other series he played against the Knicks, he shot horrible. He shot god-awful. He shot low 40s. In 1999, he shot 36% overall from the field against the Knicks. He got manhandled. So there was a reason why teams didn't build around shooters, because they couldn't be consistent enough to win during the playoffs. That's why Charles Barkley would always go on these rants about why shooters can't win during the playoffs. It's not like he was like the old man, shouting on the lawn. But the rules didn't allow it back then, just because guys couldn't be consistent enough. And it's because the playoffs were very physical. They just couldn't be consistent enough to win these games. When it comes to consistency, I feel to win games of playoffs, you had to shoot 45 and above. And it wasn't doable for even the greatest shooters during that era. Just the hand checking would not allow it. So I don't agree with that. I've seen some people put up memes of John Stockton and Jeff Hornacek. I say, like, hey, if those guys could play in that era, then Steph could too. And Jeff Hornacek, you scored 36 points in a playoff game. And why are you saying Steph couldn't do it? Hey, Steph could score 30 points or 36 points in a playoff game. The key word is consistently. Jeff Hornacek was not consistently dropping 36 points a game. He was a very good player, but he was not putting up those numbers consistently. And Steph would have the same type of situation where every now and then he could have a great game like that during the playoffs, but those games would be limited. And again, no one's saying Steph would be a scrub. What Isiah said, 18 points, I think is right around what he would be averaging. I think he would be averaging a little bit higher during a regular season because he would get more volume attempts to chuck it up. But I think the best player to compare Steph Curry to, in my eyes, is Ray Allen. That's the guy I thought Steph Curry was going to be when he first got drafted. I thought he was basically kind of like a Ray Allen clone, very similar, almost similar height. Ray's a little bit taller. Ray's like a legit 6'4", 6'5". Curry's just 6'3" tops. But that's who I thought he was going to be, just a very good shooter, going to get 20, 22 points a game, around that range, but not good enough to be an MVP or superstar candidate. I always thought Ray Allen was a very good player. Just you could say maybe superstar, but I didn't think legit in a way. Just perennial all-star for sure. I thought that was going to be Steph Curry's career. And that was where his career seemed like it was heading when he first entered in the league. He wasn't doing any great things his first several years in the league. If we bring up his numbers, just you look at them right now, from his first 3 years, he really didn't make huge dents, really. He was just a, good to decent player, 17, 18 points, 14 points. Really, the year he broke out was around 2012, 2013. And that's the year I said that where I felt the new era of the NBA came into fruition with how they allow these offensive players so much freedom. So that's when his career took off. But prior to that, he was just a decent to slightly above average player. And then those rules just changed his game completely. But Ray Allen's a guy I would compare him to. You look at his numbers throughout the 2000s. He only had, during the first, I would say the defensive era ends in 2007 in my eyes. So if you look at his numbers from 96 all the way up until 2006, he only had, I'm just going to count them right now, 1, 2, 3, 4, just counting the seasons. He only had 4 seasons where he shot 45 or above overall from the field. And that shows you how difficult it was to shoot high percentages during that era. To be a guy who could carry a team, I really feel you had to shoot 45 or above. And if you can't do it consistently, you can't win at a consistent level, shooting percentages below that. So that shows you again how much harder it was. And I just feel Curry again just took advantage of the rule changes, and he was able to explode from most likely being just at best another Ray Allen type of player to then now being the superstar player that is unstoppable. And it's due to mainly the rule changes. So I'm not saying Steph would be garbage, but I think Ray Allen is who he would have been had the rules stayed the same. And that's not an insult. Ray Allen was still a very good player, a legit Hall of Famer, but that's the category I think Steph would fall into. And you guys are also forgetting just how much the physical play just also affect not just the hand checking. You got clobbered back then driving to the hole. You got knocked down. You got the shit knocked out of you. That would have done something to Steph's confidence. I think Steph has a lot of arrogance because he knows that guys can't clobber when he come in there in the paint, and that is intimidation that guys were able to use back in the day. So I think he would not be as cocky to want to drive in there if he can't get his 3-point shot. That would have been taken away from him. And the one final thing I'm going to argue against is how people say today, young people, like, well, they didn't have zone defense back then. They have zone. Steph would have torn it up because there's no zone. The zone defense today is a scam. It is a fraud. It's not legit zone defense. I call it Walmart zone defense. It's a cheap knockoff of what legit zone defense should be. The biggest problem with the current zone defense is they had that stupid defensive 3-second violation. So you could only really play zone defense for like 3 fucking seconds before they call a violation. So you don't really have a zone. That's what I call a fake zone. That's why the NBA defenses back then prior to the zone era were just so much better, because even though you couldn't play zone, you didn't have a defensive 3-second violation. So big men could just camp in the paint. And basically they would always be waiting there to contest your shot when you broke the perimeter defense. Steph doesn't have to deal with it. Neither do all these guys have to deal with it on the perimeter. They can just set up a good play where they can get into the paint. They dribble the ball a little bit at the top of the 3-point line. They get a screen, and it's off to the races, because guys can't stay there long enough to contest it on every possession. If you have good ball movement, it's just impossible to really protect the paint the way that they did during the 90s. So that's really what I want to bring up with that. I know it's a lot of stuff, but again, I think Steph would have been basically another Ray Allen if the rules didn't get changed. So he benefits from it, and he benefits from not dealing with the physical play, the roughness of the era. Just in the previous era, you would have to have scrapped at least a few times. I think people don't realize that. But you see just a situation with just Austin Rivers several days ago. Stuff like that was the norm. If you acted like an arrogant posse, guys would hit you, knock you up with the head, across the head. There's no way Steph would not have gotten into a brawl with the way he celebrates, the way he showboats. Guys would slap you back then. Just being honest, I'm not trying to be a hater. I'm just telling the truth. That's how I was. In this NBA, it's not like that. So he has all these advantages, and he took advantage of it. I can't knock him for that. You always take advantages of of the opportunities that are in front of you. So that's just normal for any person to do that. But yeah, that's how I feel. I know I'm all over the place, but yeah. So that's my thoughts about it.